Hello and welcome to our last module, Module 12, Final Assessment and Wrap-Up. First of all, we'd like to thank you for attending our course. We hope that the information we have provided in the course is useful for you. Now let's summarize the main contents that we have covered in each content module. Module 2 defines the integrated skill approach and explains the reason why we should integrate skills in our lesson. Module 3 gives an overview of the models of integrating skills. Module 4 defines task-based instruction or TBI and explains the reasons for applying task-based instruction. This module also describes the roles of teachers and students in TBI. Module 5 describes different types of tasks, including open tasks and closed tasks. Module 6 focuses on task-based instruction framework. It also reveals the differences between traditional form-focused instruction and task-based instruction. Also, this module presents ways to evaluate the textbooks we are using in the classroom, adapt and supplement it using task-based instruction. Module 7 defines content-based instruction and explains the reasons for applying it. The module also presents the similarities and differences between content-based instruction, CBI, and content and language integrated learning, CLIL. Module 8 gives information about different models of content-based instruction. It also describes the most popular model of content-based instruction, which is theme-based instruction. Module 9 defines project-based learning and explains the reasons for applying it. The module also identifies the challenges of applying PBL. Module 10 focuses on planning a project. It describes the steps of implementing PBL as well as the roles of teachers and students. And lastly, Module 11 helps teachers understand assessment in PBL. It presents 10 tips for assessing projects in project-based learning, different sources of assessment, and how to design assessment rubrics. Now, I'd like you to examine the major objectives of the course again and evaluate whether you have achieved the objectives. Please note down the table of objectives on this slide. I will read out the objectives and you put a tick in the appropriate column. If you think you haven't achieved an objective, tick column 1. If you think you have achieved 50 to 60% of an objective, tick column 2. And if you think you have achieved 80 to 100% of an objective, please tick column 3. Let's start. Objective 1. Explain what integrated skill approach is. Objective 2. State the reasons for using integrated skill approach. Objective 3. Describe task-based instruction, its types, and instruction procedures. Objective 4. Describe content-based instruction, its models, and instruction procedures. Objective 5. Describe project-based learning and its steps. Objective 6. Evaluate lessons following integrated skills approach using a list of guiding questions. Objective 7. Enhance the integration in Vietnamese English textbooks. Objective 8. Design part of a lesson or a mini lesson following integrated skill approach. And Objective 9. Conduct a lesson or part of a lesson following integrated skill approach. How many ticks have we got in column 1, 2, and 3? To end our course wrap-up, we would like you to watch some video clips in which different ELT professors talk about different aspects of integrating skills to once again reflect on the good points of this approach.
Hello. Today I'd like to talk about an aspect of teaching which is really central to what we understand by teaching. I want to talk about some of the thinking processes that experienced teachers make use of when they teach. Teaching is not simply a matter of using certain principles, presenting certain information from a book. Teaching is a question of creating, often on the spur of the moment, an engaging lesson from whatever resources you have available to you. Now, how do teachers do this? The other day, I gave some of my student teachers a task. I said, imagine that you are in a school and the colleague who's teaching the speaking class is unable to arrive. 5 minutes before the class, the supervisor asks you to take over the class, and she hands you a glass, an empty glass, and says, that's your material for the lesson. And I set my student teachers this task, how would you use it? And about 5 groups working together quickly came up with all sorts of ideas as to how they would build a speaking lesson around that object, the glass. Some of them said, well, we'd talk about containers. We'd develop some role play activities, borrowing something from a neighbor. They had lots and lots of ideas as to how they could construct a lesson around that object, thinking quickly on their feet. I only gave them a few minutes to think of this task. Now, what are teachers doing when they engage in these kinds of activities? They're employing what are called pedagogical reasoning skills. In other words, they're looking at a piece of content, thinking about how can I get useful language learning experiences out of this? What difficulties might I encounter? What language will I need to teach in order to do the tasks I plan to use? And so on. These kinds of activities are the things that teachers do all the time when they teach, experienced teachers in particular. They look at the potential lesson that they're planning to teach. They ask, what grouping arrangements will I use? Will I need to teach extra language? Will I need to develop vocabulary or grammar around this particular activity? So teaching is a thinking process, and a lot of the thinking goes on prior to the lesson, and also quite a lot of it goes on during the lesson itself. And good teachers have this capacity to be able to look ahead, to plan, to think on their feet, and to create effective lessons based on things that happen during the course of the lesson itself. How can you acquire this skill? Well, by observing other teachers, by working with teachers with different levels of experience on planning lessons, by collaborating in different ways with experienced teachers, learning from each other. So if we want to develop our understanding of teaching in depth, we need to provide opportunities for teachers with different levels of experience and knowledge to work together on planning tasks, on teaching tasks, and from those activities to be able to share the thinking that they employ as they create effective plans for lessons or as they teach effective lessons. One of the problems I notice is that teachers just tend to teach to the book. Because the book provides a sort of comfort zone, they tend to become over-dependent on the book. And I think the best teachers are those who see the course book as a springboard, really, as the basis for a lesson. And they see it lays out the territory that they're going to cover, but they look for ways of personalizing it, making the content perhaps a little more relevant to the students' immediate needs based on some topic that might have come up in the news or in the life experiences of their students recently. So it's not the book that's teaching. The book is just providing a start, if you like, and so it's the teacher engaging with the students and improvising around the lesson that really makes the lesson effective and dynamic. So that is an issue that I think one sometimes observes. The teacher is too dependent on the book, is letting the book do the teaching rather than stepping back from the book and then letting the book be the start of the lesson, but then carrying on with their own ideas and suggestions. Both interchange and four corners are in American English or North American English, but by that we mean that the dialogues and the tasks which are used as production models, in other words, which are used to model language as a basis for repetition by the students, those are in native speaker North American English. But in many parts of the world today, although students, that might be the accent that they would prefer to learn, they do so in a way which also reflects their own cultural identity. So, for example, they might introduce features into their pronunciation which reflected they're a Portuguese speaker in Brazil, or a Spanish speaker in Mexico, or a Japanese speaker in Japan. So although those production models provide examples of native speaker English, it's not uncommon for students to feel that they want their own cultural identity. I'm Japanese, I don't mind sounding like a Japanese when I speak English. I understand native speaker English, it's not the way I want to sound. It's a personal issue. Some students do want to lose any trace of an accent, but we needn't make that a target. That's something for individual choice. On the auditory materials, the tapes and the videos for both the Four Corners and Interchange series, we also introduce other varieties of English for students to hear, to recognize that English is used in countries where it's a second or foreign language far more extensively than it is in countries where it's a mother tongue. So for many people using English today, they'll most often encounter situations where the other person they're speaking to is also a second language speaker of English. So they won't always be hearing fluent native speaker English, and so we try to educate the students, if you like, to that reality through giving them a rich exposure to other varieties of English through the audio program and the video program. Well, this is a big issue, of course, because intermediate level learners have had a lot of grammar, but they may not have necessarily had a lot of opportunities to practice using what they know effectively. In other words, they've had a lot of input, but not a huge amount of output. So one of the issues, of course, is how much practice opportunities are we providing? But those practice opportunities need to not only provide an opportunity for students to develop fluency, but also to develop accuracy. And that means they have to develop the capacity to identify the problems that they have with grammar. What are the commonest features of grammar that they're misusing? For example, I'm working with some Korean learners at the moment, and they tend to misplace adverbs. So instead of saying, I just arrived, they'll say, just I arrived. It probably comes from the word order of Korean. So we're working on that problem now. The first thing is to draw their attention to it, to give them feedback on it. A lot of students develop fluency, but they don't get much feedback on what their grammar problems are. So unless they notice what those problems are, they won't improve them. So it's practice, opportunities to use the language. It's also error correction and opportunities to notice what their problems are so that they can actually begin to focus on those problems when they're speaking. So it's using grammar as part of normal communication, but using it accurately as well as using their language fluently. I think it's very useful, but one of the issues is that most teachers associate observation with evaluation. In other words, they have typically, when they've had someone come into their class, it's been a supervisor who's giving them feedback on their teaching. I think when teachers are observing each other, they need to take this evaluation component out. They see observation as a chance to learn from each other. And so a teacher might invite a colleague into his or her class and say, look at how I set up my group work activities. Notice how I use the reading, how I prepare students for the reading task. So when you go to observe another teacher's class, you should have a purpose in mind, something that you can learn from through collecting information about how that teacher conducts his or her class. So no evaluation is necessary. It should be a chance to sort of see how does that teacher do it, why does he or she do it that way, can I learn from the way he or she is doing it. So there should always be a follow-up session, a debriefing session where the two teachers get together and discuss and say, oh, I noticed you spend quite a lot of time setting up that grammar activity. Do you always do it that way? Or whatever it is that the teacher's doing that's of interest and mutual interest. Most of the teachers of English in the world are not native speakers of English. They're probably intermediate level users of English who themselves have learned English as a second or foreign language, realize that this is an interesting career opportunity, and so have been hired in schools to teach English. Now, one of the difficulties, of course, is if you are an intermediate level user of English and you're teaching students of a lower level of proficiency, your own proficiency level will tend to be dragged down, if you like, rather than elevated. I think one of the things that you can do is to make sure you teach advanced classes from time to time, so your own language proficiency is stretched through teaching level 4 of interchange or four corners, or through teaching, for example, the passages level book. So make sure, if you're just teaching low-level students using the intro level or level 1 of a series, there's the likelihood that over time your own English will become rather like that level. So you need to stretch your own language through being in situations where you're required to do more complex things with your language. And that, the best way I can think of, is to make sure you have an opportunity to teach advanced level classes.
Hello. Today I'd like to take time to think about successful language learners. Successful language learners. In your classes, I'm sure you found, as I've done, that there are always some students who are more successful English language learners than others. They seem to be more comfortable using the language, they're more proficient. How did they get that way? I remember talking to one of my students a while ago who was from Hong Kong and who had a very natural kind of English. He was a young first-year university student, and his English was clearly much better than many of his colleagues in the same class. And I asked him to look back and think about what had made him such a good language learner. He was kind of surprised at the question, but he began to describe to me how, when he first started learning English at primary school, he had nobody in the family that spoke English. They all spoke Chinese, but when he came back from school, he would go into the bathroom and practice some of the words and sounds and sentences that he'd studied in front of the mirror, talking to himself. He was using himself as a conversation partner. Now, I just mentioned that as a little example of a learner who's realized that you have to do a little more than what is available in the classroom to be a successful language learner. There's a very limited amount of time available in the language classroom. Successful language learners are those, I think, who've often arrived at the realization that they've got to put something extra into it themselves. Find additional opportunities on the internet, at home, whatever the situation may be, to go beyond what was available in the classroom. It might be keeping a vocabulary journal, taking a note of things that they hear, new words, new expressions that they've heard, and so on. And so successful language learners seem to have realized that they need to devote a little of their private time to language learning. They need to give up something, in other words, and use that available time in productive ways to increase their language learning capacity. So it's important, I think, to find out who the most successful language learners are in your class. Have them share their experiences. What suggestions would they give to other students in the class? Have them keep journals and compare their experiences that way. So use the learners in your class as a resource to help you understand how students cope with the problems of learning a second or foreign language, and what strategies and solutions have they found worked for them. Hello. Today I'd like to talk about task-based language teaching. You may have heard quite a lot about tasks and how this approach to teaching is being used in different places.
What is task-based teaching and how does it differ from other teaching approaches? Well, to understand it, I think we need to sort of rewind a little to look at more traditional approaches to teaching, those that are built around a grammar paradigm where each lesson has a sort of presentation, practice and production phase based on the grammar focus of the lesson. Task-based teaching really goes the other way around. It starts, if you like, with tasks that students do, and from their performance on those tasks, the teacher identifies what language the students need, what language could be developed out of their task performance. So it's almost like the reverse of a typical PPP, presentation, practice, production lesson. Now, the tasks can be different kinds. They could be classroom tasks that we use simply to create the context for communication, information gap tasks, for example. Or they could be real-world tasks, things that students will use the language for outside the classroom. Interviews, checking into a hotel, activities that require students to call upon their language resources and to build communication around the opportunities that arise when they do those tasks. So task-based teaching then uses a curriculum that is built around tasks or activities, and from these activities and tasks, language development takes place. Now, whether that can be used as the sole basis for a language course, I very much doubt. It puts a huge amount of responsibility on the teacher. And also the student's performance is likely to be a little unpredictable depending on what their language proficiency is. So there's a lot of work on the teacher's part to really build language development around the student's task performance. But as a technique, I'm all in favor of it. In fact, I use it a lot. So as a technique, it means that from time to time, you use tasks to assess what students are able to do, to set priorities for teaching, and to build language awareness around students' performance on tasks.
Content-based language teaching is implemented in a great variety of settings. It's implemented with majority language students who are learning a foreign language in, for example, immersion classes or content and language integrated classes. It's also implemented with second language learners who are minority language students learning all of their subject matter in a school where the majority language is spoken. And what I think is maybe the most interesting about these two different settings is how different the expectations are about what students can accomplish. In the second language situation, where minority language students are learning the majority language, the expectation is often that students will be able to learn the new language to a level of near native mastery, and they'll be able to do that in a year or two to catch up with their peers. In the foreign language situation, the experience of content-based language teaching is seen primarily as an enrichment. It's an opportunity for students who already speak the majority language to add something to their knowledge. In the second language situation, students are often discouraged from using their mother tongue. In the foreign language situation, the mother tongue is always a part of students' education. So both in terms of expectations and also in terms of the role of the mother tongue, the two environments are quite different. And yet in the classroom, the challenges are often quite similar.
I wonder if we could move on to look at the rationale for task-based approaches, what we know about learning and that suggests that adopting a task-based approach is advantageous.
The rationale for task-based language teaching actually draws on a number of different theoretical positions. It draws on an assumption that the goal of language teaching should be to develop that type of knowledge, that procedural knowledge that will enable learners to participate easily, naturally in communication. And the kind of knowledge that is required for that is really implicit knowledge of language rather than explicit knowledge of language. So task-based language teaching serves as a means for helping learners to develop implicit knowledge. And the underlying idea is that the use of tasks in the classroom enables the teachers to create the conditions for language learning and for communicating that exist outside the classroom. And that in order to learn how to communicate outside the classroom, one needs to replicate those same conditions inside the classroom. Traditional language teaching, much of it engages the learner in careful, controlled production, develops perhaps explicit knowledge rather than implicit knowledge. And thus there is often a problem of transfer of what they're able to do in the classroom to what they are able to do when they are communicating in the real world, face to face with people. So that is one of the principal rationales for task-based language teaching. A second rationale for task-based language teaching is the recognition that task-based language teaching caters to incidental language acquisition. That is to say, the acquisition that takes place without any deliberate intention on the part of the learner. And it's argued that in general, most of the learning that takes place when one learns a language is incidental rather than intentional. There are limits to how much one can learn of a language intentionally. There are limits to whether one can intentionally master the pronunciation of the deliberate sounds that make up the language. There are limits to the number of words that one can learn intentionally. There are limits to the extent to which one can learn the complete grammar of a language intentionally. And therefore, much of the learning that takes place has to be incidental. And task-based language teaching does, of course, cater to incidental language learning.
Thank you for that.
That's the end of our module. We hope that you can learn useful things from this course and can apply these things in your teaching. Thank you and goodbye.